Who is the greatest king of all time? A Macedonian from Macedonia. Alexander, called the Great, remembered from whole humanity, son of Philip and Olympia. Alexander of Macedon, ruler of the great Macedonian Empire. This is the story of the greatest king of all time. A story from Paeonia, told in the way of barbarians. Story from a nation who practiced strange rituals, with customs that remain incomprehensible to the common people today. A story told by a nation who in antiquity did not have a republic, but kingdoms and empires. A nation that built cities, settlements, towers, and fortresses at a time when ancestors of today's modern citizens did not yet know how to work stone. A nation that gave the world culture and civilization values that are valid even in the time they call the 21st century.
Ne placi, milolibe, ne žadla.
Who is the one whose name was remembered by the world from ancient times to this day? About whom have the most books been written in human history? What was the hero like who from his youngest days began to conquer with wisdom? Where did the man come from about whom humanity has been writing, translating, thinking, and inventing for more than 2,300 years? A great man, king of an empire that spanned 3 continents, a supreme military leader, and a philosopher about whom much is known, yet no one knows where his grave is located. He reportedly died about 40 days before his 33rd birthday. A Macedonian from Macedonia, king of the great Macedonian Empire. His name is Alexander, King Alexander of Macedonia. Let those who speak ill of Alexander not forget his good deeds and exploits, but first of all, let them ask themselves about their own life and compare the time given to them on this earth with just one day in the life of Alexander the Great, the king from Macedonia, whose name became famous for eternity. In his day, and in the centuries that followed, there was neither a nation nor a city that did not know the name of Alexander of Macedonia. His name is mentioned in the Bible, the Quran, and the Talmud, in the old books of all European, almost all Asian, and some African countries. Legends about him are still being told all over the world. He is a man whose life recounted in books was a more revered story than the religious books as well. Alexander the Great was, is, and will be an inspiration for countless works of art, sculptures, engravings, and monuments. A Macedonian from Macedonia, son of Philip and Olympia, king of the Macedonian Empire, the first among equals in Macedonia, a ruler and leader who set the example for the unification of the world through culture and science. The Romans called him Magnus the Great. Muslims still tell stories about Zulkarnain, the one with two horns, Iskandar, Shandor, Sikandar, Skanda, Babajan. His name is omnipresent. The Macedonian king Alexander left an indelible mark on humanity, and with his life and work set an example for a world empire founded on moral and philosophical principles, achieving statesmanship and human success that was and remains unsurpassed. The generations of people living on the planet Earth in the centuries after Alexander have not preserved the original records of his time. Fragments of ancient testimonies are mostly available to the general public through modern translations of preceding translations from even earlier translations, which were also translated from the ancient Macedonian language and the script of the Great Macedonian Empire. Translations, transcriptions, copies, collected excerpts, retellings of translations of old records, and other stories have been transcribed over the last 2,000 years. Most books in the history of mankind have been written about Alexander the Great. Until just a few centuries ago, books about the life, exploits, and works of Alexander were literally the most widely read literature in the entire world. Most of the time, those stories reached modern literature due to the above-mentioned translations and transcriptions. The same sources were copied, and many even unknowingly worked to cover up the great mystery about the greatest king of all time, Alexander of Macedonia, Alexander the Great, Alexander, the king of the Macedonians, and the Great Macedonian Empire. His parents and first teachers were his mother Olympia and his father Philip. They met and fell in love during the ritual of the ancient mysteries in Samothrace. According to today's reckoning of time, his mother Olympia gave birth to him in the days from July 20th to the 23rd in the year 356 BC. According to legends, when the son of Philip of Macedon was born, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus burned down. His mother was waiting for the stars to line up to give birth to him at the exact hour, as the priests had predicted. When he received the news that heir had been born to him, his father had just won a battle, and his advisors had predicted that his son would be invincible, because besides the victory and the happy news, they also informed him of the victory of one of his generals and the success of one of his racehorses. 2 eagles landed above the royal palace, which was interpreted as a great omen. According to some historical sources, Olympia and Philip had strange dreams when they married. Before the wedding, Olympia dreamed that thunder and lightning struck her in the womb, after which a strong fire blazed and spread everywhere. Allegedly, after the wedding, Philip dreamed that he was stamped a seal with the image of a lion on his wife's womb. Alexander was born at the beginning of the Leo sign in today's calendar, and it is known that wherever he built and conquered, he built lion monuments. Mankind has also preserved his close encounters with lions, represented in works of art and mosaics. Like Heracles, the forefather of the Macedonians, he also wore lion paraphernalia and regalia. From the old books, one can read that from his earliest childhood, the nanny Lanika and his first instructors, Leonidas and Lysimachus, were taking care of him. Apart from them, Alexander was also taught by Alcippus, Philiscus, Polynices, and other teachers. The wisdom of the young heir to the Macedonian state showed itself in his early childhood. When he was about 7 years old, representatives from the royal court of Persia came to his father Philip's palace. For a period of time, Philip also gave protection to some of the Persian statesmen. The young prince astonished the Persians, asking them about their readiness for war, about the length of the roads that led into Asia, about the distant kingdoms far to the east that he had read about in books, and about how the Persians treated their enemies. The astonishment by the level of conversation of Philip's child in Persia announced that Macedonia was already preparing a successor. One of the most retold episodes from the life of Alexander the Great is the first meeting with his legendary horse, Bucephalus. Medieval translations of ancient records preserve traditions and legends about Bucephalus, according to which King Alexander's horse was the last unicorn. The taming of the horse by turning him toward the sun so that it could no longer see its own shadow was the beginning of their journey to the end of the world. Allegedly, Alexander was taught the skills and knowledge for the future great campaign by his teacher Aristotle. Those who claim this have forgotten that according to historical data, Aristotle taught Alexander since he was 13 years old, and less than 3 years later, his father Philip appointed him regent of Macedonia. It is unknown why Aristotle was part of Alexander's education for only 3 years. Aristotle was not even involved in the great campaign to the east, and years later his nephew, the scribe Callisthenes, along with his cousins, were sentenced to death by Alexander for trying to kill him. At the age of 16, Alexander got what he wanted from his earliest childhood, to fulfill the vows of his ancestors in a war that was a holy campaign for the Macedonians. He knew about the Macedonians' habits of betraying and killing each other in order to get power, about the old wars with Persia, about the campaigns towards the end of the world, but also about the fact that once upon a time, long before his time, there was a great kingdom of the Mother Earth and the Father Sun that extended over all the known world. Alexander knew what he had to do to reach the descendants of the ancient sages, what he had to ask them, but also what to convey to them. It took the son of Philip and Olympia a few years to unite and subdue all his country's neighbors, and then, in a decade, he managed not only to open the old libraries, but also to create new ones that laid the foundation for the spread of Macedonian culture in Africa and Asia in the centuries after him. That is why the testimonies of all the peoples who lived on the territory of the great Macedonian Empire show that Alexander visited them in order to include them in his kingdom, without changing anything from their traditions and habits, except within the organization of local and state management in the great Macedonian Empire. His closest friends, young and strong, with the support of Philip's older generals and the power of the Macedonian state, were ready to start a campaign against the largest kingdom at that time, the Great Persia. The campaign of the Macedonian kingdom and the creation of the great Macedonian Empire was a challenge that the city-states not only did not have the courage to tackle, but also did not have the awareness to know the meaning and importance of the greatest scientific expedition in the history of mankind. There are traces of that former Macedonian Empire today in Asia, Africa, all over Europe, and even in South America. In many places in the world, but also in the state that even today bears the name of Alexander's empire. Yet it is not a monarchy, but a republic of Macedonia. A young republic created according to the city's polis, and Rome and the Romans, the same ones who set artificial borders, desperately wanting to copy Alexander and the example of the Macedonian Empire, did everything and anything to forget the glory of Macedonia, including the Macedonian name. The whole modern civilization is based on two completely unstable pillars, Rome and, quote, ancient Greece, both representing the basis of Western civilizational values in the 21st century. But in antiquity, there was neither the term ancient Greece nor any kind of Greek state. Rome inherited the roads and towns from the Macedonian Empire and forcibly took out of its borders not only art, precious stones, gold, and books, but also evicted many of the people from the home of the king of Macedonia. Just like the Persians centuries before him, when they forcibly evicted Macedonian and Paeonian tribal communities from Axios in today's Asia Minor. There, even today, there are toponyms that are too similar to the Macedonian ones. And not only there, Hellenic civilization and culture is actually Macedonian culture and civilization that was spread from Kittim to Cathay. Several centuries ago, quote, modern scientists invented the term Greece and Balkan Peninsula, which continued the old agenda of erasing the memory of the great kingdom of the sun and the Mother Earth, Macedonia. In addition to that, there is also the constant retelling of the stories of Mactanebo about the fact that Alexander allegedly did not respect his father and that he was not Philip's son. Many modern authors, similar to older generations, chose some episode from the records of the life of Philip and Alexander, and based on small fragments, they created a mountain out of a molehill. Which father and son in Macedonia have not quarreled at least once in their life? Were Philip and Alexander the only king and prince who had misunderstandings? Whose son was Alexander, if not Philip's? Who gave him the power and made him regent at the age of 16? The role of the greatest man in Europe, King Philip of Macedon, in the life of his son Alexander, is often belittled, and the importance of King Philip from the foundations of the empire that his son expanded to the end of the world tends to be reduced and skipped over. Alexander marched to Persia to continue the Holy War his father had started over the history of their ancestors. Alexander grew up with the stories of the Argead lineage. In his time, the legends of Dionysus, Heracles, and Perseus were legends about events that actually happened, and Homer's writings read not as myths, but as history that really happened. Alexander continued what his father Philip had started, the creation of the largest state in the world. Meanwhile, in Athens, Demosthenes taught the citizens not only to hate him, but also to curse Philip the king of Macedon and the entire Macedonian nation. Alexander's courage was shown precisely against those who had the most derogatory words about the Macedonians. The Battle of Chaeronea is an event that was not only remembered by history, but is also retold today. The protection of the wounded Philip by his son Alexander, the determination of the heir to the Macedonian kingdom, and the fortitude recognized by the most experienced generals at the height of the battle led to a great victory for Macedonia. According to some historians, the great victory of the Macedonians happened on August 2nd, 2,360 years ago. After this battle, the so-called League of Corinth was formed, which remained an example of unification on a regional level that was complemented on a world level by the inclusion of Sparta and the successes of Alexander and his army. Philip's military endeavor was complemented by excellent diplomacy, and preparations for the great campaign began to be announced. The Macedonians went east. The Macedonian state was not only the largest military force in Europe, but also a center for the development of education, medicine, and other sciences, and a nursery for artists who created works that cannot be copied to this day. A Macedonian kingdom that built cities and ports on 3 continents and spread Macedonian culture all over the world. In the time of Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander, there was no state called Greece, nor was there any state called Hellas. There were disunited and quarreling city-states that were in constant mutual conflicts for centuries. The Macedonians' affiliation to the so-called Helleni is categorically rejected not only by modern historians, but also in ancient records. The city-states themselves fell under the cunning skills of Philip, who, manipulating them, laid the foundations of the well-known divide-and-rule policy. It is often said that Philip and Alexander supposedly had to be good to Athens and other cities because Macedonia had no ships. However, it is noted that already in 334 BC, Alexander disbanded the fleet of the city-states. The infantry troops from the city-states did not participate in any major battles in Alexander the Great's campaign. Many representatives of the so-called Glorious Hellas and Great Greece fought on the side of Persia against Macedonia. The city-states tried to stand out as a higher race than the Macedonian barbarians. Traitors and conspirators who never missed an opportunity for intrigues and scheming from early antiquity to this day. Even today, when Philip was killed in 336 BC, like many kings and emperors before him, the citizens of the city-states not only rejoiced at the death of the Macedonian ruler, but also propagated that the plans for the campaign would supposedly be stopped. Only few people in Athens believed that the heir would uphold the kingdom created by his father. Their arrogance and disobedience were cruelly punished for the second time by Alexander, again in Thebes, after which it was clear to everyone about the strength of the Macedonian kingdom. Historians have noted that some of the Macedonians had the opportunity to be included in the friends of the emperor and friends of Alexander. Allowing selected Macedonians to be in close proximity to the ruler was a tradition that Alexander inherited from his father Philip, and in his time there were friends of the king and friends of Philip. Unlike the city-states that did not have their own army, but had mercenaries, in the Macedonian state the army was hierarchically organized, militarily and ritually prepared, and motivated not by money, but by an ideal. Macedonia was too small for Alexander, since he as a child knew that he could conquer the world. Alexander's coronation was in accordance with all ancient Macedonian traditions. The king of Macedonia continued the preparations started by his father. He left Macedonia to conquer the world. He was not the first one from these parts to move on. Dion's March was an old story of great significance. The Trojan War told a little closer history to the time of Alexander, and the troubles with the Persian Empire in the previous centuries were the reason for the attempt at unification. Confirmation of the hiding of the Macedonian language from the official history is also found in the official terms for objects, events, armies, and toponyms from antiquity. The campaign of the Macedonians was accompanied by scientists, doctors, philosophers, and entire caravans. The Macedonian Empire, which Emperor Alexander managed to spread to 3 continents in just 1 decade, left an invaluable cultural legacy to the entire human civilization. Almost every modern country that is located in the territory that was ruled by Alexander the Great has preserved archaeological sites, writings, and artifacts from the Great Macedonian Empire. In less than 13 years, the king of Macedonia managed to conquer not only the Persian Empire, but also many other empires and kingdoms. Those who were civilizationally prepared to belong to the former one-world empire that was resurrected with Alexander's empire were expecting him even before he arrived in their regions. They even invited him. The cities in the dark forest and mountain regions of Asia, in which there were remnants of the former actions of the ancestors of the local inhabitants against the ancestors of the Macedonians, especially those who showed resistance, suffered the cruelty of Alexander the Great and his great army. A phalanx of chosen heroes, led by Macedonians who were imbued with the idea and ideal of the Macedonian Empire. Neither Greeks nor Hellenes, but Macedonians for whom Philip created a kingdom, and Alexander an empire. It is known that Alexander's companions and contemporaries wrote about him, and famous authors from several centuries after him. Several groups of recorders led by Eumenes and Diodotus and Callisthenes were in charge of the imperial diaries during the campaign. In antiquity, works were published by Ptolemy, Aristobulus, Nearchus, Anaximenes, Aesop, Androsthenes, Callisthenes, Cleitarchus, Crito, Darius, Eumenes, Euphippus, Hieronymus, Thymogenes, Trogus, Metis, and other writers, military leaders, and historians. The authors whose works on the life of King Alexander the Great are used in today's literature are mostly Arian, who read the writings of Ptolemy, Aristobulus, and Nearchus, and who published the Indica and the Anabasis of Alexander. Arian lived in the 2nd century AD. Plutarch lived in the second half of the 1st and the beginning of the 2nd century AD, and published a description of the life of Alexander the Great in his publication Comparative Lives, and 2 speeches about the Emperor of Macedon in the Moralia. Quintus Curtius Rufus, also about 4 centuries after the time of King Alexander, published the history of Alexander the Great of Macedon, which used material from Ptolemy and Clitarchus. Another frequently used source on Alexander the Great is Justin's History of Philip, an abridged version of an earlier history written by Trogus. One of the oldest surviving records is Diodorus Siculus' Bibliotheca Historica from the 1st century AD, written according to Cleritarchus and Hieronymus. Many of the transcripts and translations of ancient records mention that during the campaign, Alexander sent and received many letters from Aristotle and his mother Olympia. Part of Alexander's letters about the new world he discovered while traveling to the east, and alleged excerpts from the imperial diary were republished in the first centuries of our era as Secretum Secretorum. In the translations of the old records about the time of Alexander the Great, one can read retold testimonies of his generals, in which the encounters of the Macedonian army with the various tribes and peoples in Asia are explained. Far away in India, the Macedonian soldiers also met people who presented themselves as descendants of the army from the campaigns of Heracles and Dion. They were not the only ones who left traces at the end of the world. According to some historical records, Alexander the Great had several children. According to the stories and legends, he had many children because in almost every kingdom he reached, he was asked for offspring. Encounters with the queen of the famous warrior women of the Amazon were not just legends, but a true story. The queen of the Amazons traveled a long way to ask the king of the Macedonian Empire to make her a child, and that was not the only woman who, during the Great Campaign, asked for and received offspring from the greatest king of all time. Calazena, Campaspa, Cleopa, Baria, Barcina, Roxana. Heracles is the first son of Alexander and Barcina. Allegedly, Roxana gave birth to a baby boy who died young, and Alexander IV is the second child of Roxana and the king of Macedon. According to available historical records, both Heracles and Alexander were later killed. Some historians have written that it is possible that Alexander left offspring with Darius's daughter, Statira. Many have tried to portray Alexander as an immoral and depraved man, but records from the Far East show that he was hailed as a philosopher from whom every emperor wished to have a grandson. Chinese legends and Islamic stories have even mentioned that the Emperor of China gave his daughter to Alexander. Japanese legends say that when Alexander went under the water, he married the daughter of the Sea Emperor, with whom he had 3 sons. Even today, in many countries located on the territory of the former Great Macedonian Empire, there are clans who present themselves as descendants of the ancient Macedonians from the time of Philip and Alexander. Almost 2.5 millennia after his time, his name still resonates. Many still learn from his life. The military strategy of the Macedonians is studied in the most prestigious universities in the world, and perhaps the most sheets of paper have been written about Alexander the Macedonian in general in world history. All of Asia, all of Europe, and half of Africa have preserved stories, traditions, and legends about Alexander of Macedonia. He is often portrayed as a righteous philosopher who set out on a journey to learn about miracles and wonders, to visit holy places, and to share and gain ancient knowledge. Apparent from the legends about him in the countries he visited, the literature of the past 2 millennia have preserved more than enough records of the greatest emperor of all time. The legends preserve the story not only about the conquest of the earth, but also of the sky and the sea by Alexander the Great. When he wanted to fly, he and his friends tamed 2 huge eagles that drove the king across the sky. When he wanted to dive, scientists made him a glass barrel. He went to the dark lands to seek the water of life. He also reached the fountain of youth. According to some, he also found the emerald tablets of Hermes, Ermo. Legends of the water of immortality are often associated with his sisters. He had 1 sister, Cleopatra, and 3 half-sisters, Thessalonica, Canana, and Europa, and half-brother Charon. Alexander's sisters prepared some of his equipment for the campaign and are often associated with the legends of the search and finding of the water of life. Niccolo Machiavelli, Isaac Newton, Marco Polo also wrote about Alexander of Macedonia. A large part of Leonardo da Vinci's inventions were inspired by the military equipment of the Macedonian phalanx, and every European country has its own medieval translations of some of the books about Alexander of Macedonia. Some have older translations. They usually call him the Great. Those far east preserved his memory as a philosopher, to whom almost every ruler organized a huge welcome, and even asked him to leave them offspring together with the Macedonian warriors from the famous phalanx. History is a story to which something was undoubtedly done. History was written by the victors, and the victorious records from the time of Alexander have been changed to such an extent that many countries are today associated with the spiritual victory of the Macedonian Empire, and Macedonia has been deprived of the opportunity to share the civilizational memory of the greatest king of all time, Alexander the Macedonian. As in the time of Alexander, when the Macedonians conspired against him, even in Macedonia, while he and the phalanx were on the campaign, it is somehow the same today. Why did he burn Persepolis? Were rituals practiced there that contradicted the teachings of the ancient school of light? And were there records that could bring misfortune to the world? One cannot know. Yet we do know that he rebuilt the tomb of Cyrus, took care of Darius's wife and daughters, and was merciful to many. Of course, he also was cruel and merciless when there was a need for it. Israel, Syria, Egypt, and half of Asia accepted him as their ruler. He fought Darius, but did not kill him because Darius fled and was killed by his own. He fought Porus, with whom he later became friends. Alexander conquered in order to unite. Did he really make a wedding for 10,000 couples? If one reads more carefully, he can learn that the wedding was for about 80 Macedonians and their chosen women, and then all the marriages of the soldiers who created families during the campaign and gave birth and numbered about 10,000 were officially approved. With their children who were born to them during the campaign, they may have reached the number of the expedition that went on a campaign for Macedonia. Do the rulers in the last millennium, those royal lines around the world, have anything to do with Alexander? Romanticism when retelling stories about Alexander is inevitable, but whether the memories about him in Macedonia are romantic memories or truths, we do not know. The Macedonian people sang many songs and legends about Alexander. Just as the Macedonians in the 19th century, who referred to the memory of the Macedonian king, were declared romantics, so we can freely declare all Roman and Greek propaganda about Alexander, the king of Macedonia, as a failed attempt at romance.
placi, milolibe me žadla.
From the Renaissance to this day, the Macedonians record and publish their research, myths, stories, and legends about Alexander the Macedonian. And it is not because they were defeated, but because they are victors and have preserved the memory of their king, a king who left them a homeland that no modern kingdom or state can take over, but only try to rename it with the people who live in it and the language they speak, but by their own means, because Macedonia lives on higher, spiritual levels. The Macedonian language of the Macedonians from Macedonia, and the Macedonian script, which originate from before the times of the kings Philip and Alexander. Romanticism is the memory of Rome and Hellas, and Macedonia is the eternal memory of human civilization, for one world kingdom in which everyone will be equal under the same sky, and one Lord for all. A kingdom founded on principles that were destroyed by the unwillingness of many of the peoples, mostly the Macedonians, who strayed from the spiritual path of King Alexander and passed into the low spheres of materialism. What did the Macedonians know in the 19th century, and what legends did they inherit from the Middle Ages? Did the ancient stories survive on the territory of Macedonia millennia after the time of Alexander? The folk songs, stories, and legends that have been preserved in Macedonia show that the memory of Alexander the Great has been preserved for more than 2,000 years in his homeland as well. All hypotheses that claim that contemporary Macedonians appropriate Alexander's heritage from other nations and use it in their own folklore are frivolous. Numerous written and oral traditions and poems show that the presence of King Alexander the Great in the consciousness of the Macedonians. Travel writers in the 16th century noted places that the people said were from the time of Alexander, and there are also testimonies of Macedonians who worked throughout Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries and sang songs about Alexander the Great. At the beginning of the 19th century, it was noted that the Macedonians remembered two rulers the most, King Marco and King Alexander. Many authors from all over Europe began to write about Alexander the Great, but also to relate him to Macedonia. Many of the books from the 19th century connected King Alexander with the Slavs and show that the people of the territory of Macedonia have always lived in the homeland. This is also the case in some of the preserved old songs about Alexander the Great. There are poems about the birth of Alexander, his campaign and marriage, about him and the three messengers, his friendship with Bucephalus, his dreams and predictions, about the generosity of King Alexander, about the journey to the end of the earth, about the water of life, and many others. The legends that have survived to this day through scientific works and books talk about the old cities in Macedonia from the time of Alexander, about his birth and life, about the inventions of King Alexander, about his sister and the immortal water, and other fantastic stories. The Miladinov brothers, Shepkarov, Kapankov are some of the Macedonian revivalists who collected materials about Alexander the Great. Rakovsky, Verkovic, Novakovic, and others also wrote about Alexander. And in the works of Plevsky, Prilichev, Mazovsky, Ginot, Kapankov, and others, significant information published in the 19th century is revealed. In the 19th century, the prophecies of Alexander by Atanas the Macedonian were published in Venice. The poems of Georgy Plevsky, the words of Grigor Prilichev, the memories of Isaji Mazovsky, the poems of Marko Kapankov, and other records from the 19th century represent a huge treasure not only for Macedonia, but also for the world, because they are a confirmation of continuity for more than 2 millennia. In the great general history of the Macedonian Slavs by Plevsky, the Starsnavik of Alexander is also included, which represents Macedonian Alexandrida. Translations of books about Alexander that were found in monasteries and were written in ecclesiastical script, i.e. the Old Macedonian script, are also known. A story dating back to the 17th century, describing Alexander's search for the water of life, even mentions his sister, who according to the story became immortal, pretended to be a mermaid, or became a fairy. The same story was recorded and published in the 19th century, but with a different name for Alexander's sister. Legends from the villages along the river Babuna and Avkapol Valley have also been recorded, in which they talk about the old flag of the Macedonian state, and that this flag was hidden in the men's apron, which is part of the Avkapol folk costume. It was also inevitable to mention that the Macedonian state, the Great Phalanx, and the kings Philip and Alexander, whenever the Macedonians fought for freedom and demanded justice. This was done not only by the rich people abroad who lobbied for the Principality of Macedonia, but also by the common people who never stopped rebelling and fighting. The Macedonian insurgents who started the Macedonian uprising in Kresna in 1878 also showed that they were aware of their connection to the Macedonians from the times of Philip and Alexander. Alexander is also mentioned by the Lozorites, the secret society of the Macedonian Revolution. They were even accused of a conspiracy to restore the Macedonian Empire, headed by one of the editors of Loza magazine. The whole revolutionary struggle is imbued with memories of Alexander's glorious state. If they had made a kingdom instead of a republic, they might have freed themselves. Both Kirst, Petkov, Miriskov, and the revolutionaries in the decades later mentioned King Alexander the Macedonian in their writings. It was only at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century that the Macedonians again increased the number of published works about Alexander the Great. In recent decades, all kinds of articles and books have been published, as well as many wonderful works about Alexander the Great, written by Macedonians from Macedonia. He was and remained a guiding star during all the struggles for the liberation of the Macedonian people. Literature left a huge body of memory of Alexander all over the world, and most printed editions were published all over Europe, where almost every country includes the translations of books about Alexander the Great in its oldest literature. Many appropriate him and dare to try to forbid Macedonia and the Macedonians to announce their memory of King Alexander to the world. Macedonia does not appropriate it because it gave him to the world and humanity so that everyone would be better, not worse. Did copyists deliberately try to modify his stories and present him as an immoral man who abused alcohol in order for the spiritual greatness of Alexander the Great to be forgotten? Maybe that's why all the pressure comes on one of the few countries in the world that in the 21st century bears the name of one of the countries from before our era, the ancient Macedonia. In the millions of pages written about Alexander the Great, the question that can rarely be read anywhere is, what were his sisters and his mother doing while the coffin was being prepared and was on its way to Macedonia? Did they, with the closest relatives of Philip and Olympia and the most trusted associates, prepare a conspiracy that has shaken the world for centuries? It is known that Alexander communicated with Aristotle and Olympia through letters. The different versions about the funeral procession of Alexander the Great tells us that although according to tradition he should have been buried in Macedonia, contrary to Macedonian customs, he was embalmed and mummified, and the coffin was allegedly grabbed by one of his best friends, Ptolemy. Many have written about Ptolemy reversing the funeral procession and replacing the sarcophagus with another full of honey. The role of Alexander's mother, Olympia, in the greatest world history is still unclear, and the question arises whether she left her son to be buried far from the real homeland, Macedonia. The eternal resting place of Alexander of Macedonia is a mystery to mankind, and we may never know if and from what Alexander died, or if he even died then, because the 40 days before he turned 33 represent important symbolism in ancient mysteries and teachings. What did Philip and Olympia's son learn until the 40 days before his 33rd birthday? According to several traditions around the world, the soul needs exactly that much, about 6 weeks, to arrive to the other world, but also to adapt to this world. Today, in several locations on the globe, the alleged tomb of Alexander is mentioned mythologically. He was poisoned, infected with syphilis, fell ill with malaria, etc., was published about him, but the truth is far from today's level of consciousness of human civilization. Even today, there are different versions about his eternal resting place, which is allegedly in Egypt, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Israel, India, in various locations throughout Europe, for which numerous failed archaeological surveys were also made. The stories about the alleged visit of the Roman rulers in Alexandria and their touching the body of Alexander are unfounded, because we know that even before them, the Macedonians saw the golden sarcophagus in Alexandria was empty and melted it down. The same stories are told in Macedonia. There is almost no region in Macedonia without a theory of a conspiracy or alleged legend about the tomb of Alexander the Great. Official archaeology and history deny all these mystical claims of the Macedonia. A folktale from the Krtovo region describes in detail the funeral procession with the body of the king, which was greeted by the people with many flowers on the road along which it traveled, before being sent to an unknown location somewhere in Ovčje region. Another story tells about the names of the villages of Gornji and Dolni Balvan, Upper and Lower Balvan, according to which 2 large oak trunks were carried by a great army as they were passing through, one of which was full of honey, and in the other a sarcophagus was hidden. Perhaps the loyal peons and Alexander's family tried to fulfill the king's wish to be buried where he was born, in his homeland, Macedonia. Was he happy and satisfied with his life? According to historians, one can learn that in addition to being generous and compassionate, he was also very sad. This is also confirmed by the records that reported that, like his father, there was an attempt on his life too. Did the conspirators succeed? Whether and how the king died and what really happened in those times, one can only guess. What can be read between the lines is that he was sad because some Macedonians did not understand the meaning of the campaign and their satisfaction with the spoils of war instead of spiritual satisfaction. Historians also noticed his sadness when soldiers died, when couriers and scouts were late, when he was returning on foot and his friends led his fleet, when his friends and his closest ally, the horse Bucephalus, died, but also when they tried to oppose him, gossiped about him, and even tried to poison him. Well, are we to believe the translations, transcriptions, and alterations of the records by Callisthenes, the scribe of Alexander, the nephew of the famous Aristotle, who, together with his cousins, were sentenced to death by the king personally because they hatched a fraudulent conspiracy and committed the greatest treason? They tried to kill Alexander of Macedonia. Did he realize that after he organized a world empire which he established on ancient foundations, that people were not ready to be equal, because he was challenging the nations to show the level of development they had reached and together with the Macedonians to put an end to the old era of betrayals, envy, greed, and malice, but it was difficult for him to succeed, which is confirmed by the collapse of the empire. Maybe he found out what he needed, so he really deceived everyone, and only the most faithful knew about his secret. Even today, one can hear that 2,300 years have not passed since then. It is still told long and wide when and how he died, and where he was buried, and no one knows his grave, nor exactly where he was born, and what were the old capitals of his ancestors. He must not have gone to India and back out of pure curiosity. He took and brought back culture, heritage, and civilizational values. The records from the East tell about the high level of consciousness with which he arrived in the distant countries, and the same can be read in the Macedonian stories and traditions about the king who was very good and a great philosopher. Many wanted to portray him as a cruel conqueror, an immoral person, and a vain man, But did those who emphasize the negative episodes of his life, which we are not sure how faithfully they are translated, did anything in life that can at least be compared to a moment from the days of the son of Philip in Olympia? Also, many authors try to present him as a kind of unifier, similar to today's states, communities, and unions. One cannot depict the life or describe the works that Alexander did without venturing in what amounts to science fiction. Because the world and the time since then have not seen such a hero. It is often said in Asian traditions that it was shameful for the Macedonians to be seen as bullies because they did not commit terror or they did not encounter resistance. They knew that ruling by the sword was different from ruling by kindness, so on the way to India, many cities, palaces, and forts opened their gates to them without any resistance. Faithful to the fatherland and the king, with the shield or on it, they realized the ideals of their ancestors, restoration of the great kingdom of the earth and the sun. One of Alexander's staunchest allies were the Peons. For what reasons some of them resisted when he arrived in their countries in order to organize them for a campaign, and some unreservedly accepted the call, it is difficult to guess. What we do know is that the infantry and cavalry of the phalanx, who came from Paeonia, never disobeyed or opposed the king during the campaign. Their leader from the royal house of Paeonia, Ariston, returned to Paeonia, that is, to the Macedonian state, which was united by Philip of Macedon. Paeonia was the upper country for them at that time, the same territory that was called the lower country by the rulers from the Middle Ages. The connection and mutual trust is hidden in the centuries the official history calls mythological, when people lived with a level of consciousness that today's generation of people on planet Earth can hardly contemplate. There are also those who still recount his quests for holy stones and waters that brought immortality, meetings with Sufis, Brahmins, sages of all faiths, and teachings wherever he set foot. He built and created, united and developed, and in Macedonia he sent caravans and ships full of valuables, books, seeds, spices, and whatnot. Knowing about the many cities from Thrace to India that were built during his reign of the Macedonian Empire on earth, can we imagine? And what is it that he ordered to be built on and in the land of Macedonia? There are still stories about his campaign, about the 7 wonders of the Old World that were on the territory of the Macedonian Empire, about his meetings with nations and tribes in Asia, all kinds of stories, even those according to which he made the first submarine and diving suit, made the mirror as it is today, that from that point in time until today, not more than 2,000 years have passed, but less, even that he faked his death, and 1,000 years were like the day of yesterday. Is it possible that his grave is located in the territory of today's Macedonia, which today is not a kingdom like in ancient times, but a republic? The land of Pan, which has been part of the Macedonian state since time immemorial, may be hiding the greatest secret of antiquity, and that is the legacy that invisibly and invincibly helps the Macedonians to survive. 2,300 years have passed, and the sanctuary needs to be cleansed. The memory of Alexander, who even today inspires a large number of Macedonians, scattered and disputed in different parts of the globe, has been alive for centuries and millennia. What we certainly should not repeat is the schism and behavior of his generals after his supposed death in Babylon, but to be loyal to the ideal as were the military leaders and soldiers who returned with his wife and son to Macedonia, and who remained faithful until death to them and his mother, and therefore to him and his father. As in his own time, when he was propagated to have died during his father's lifetime, it is from that moment that when mentioning him, most of the modern world is preoccupied with his death and the location of his grave. With this work, we commemorate the day of his birth, the birthday of King Alexander of Macedonia, the greatest king of all time, actually never died. His spirit lives on forever for humanity and Macedonia, because 1,000 years are like the day of yesterday, and the stone has its own weight. King Alexander of Macedonia is alive. Alive! Long live the king! Eternal memory to the son of Philip and Olympia, the King Alexander of Macedonia, the greatest emperor of all time.